The Clash, I Fought the Law. I fought the law and the law won. Gonna learn a little bit about Mesopotamian politics today. It's all about the law. What law? Well, we'll get to that in a moment, right? But the politics of Mesopotamia were pretty driven and focused on the same thing that we've been learning about, right? Like this is an entire civilization, and like everything centered around food supply and the control of food, right? We talked about the history and the geography was centered around food, right? The silt and the river valleys. He said the culture was centered around food. With the temples and the exchange of the economics of that little token, that shekel, for, in order to have more kids so you could have more workers on your farm so you could have more food. The whole social structure was centered around food production and controlling land so you could have food. I mean, everything was about the food, and the politics aren't going to be any different. Politics, just as a reminder, right? Politics are the study of people's ideas and how those ideas become powerful enough to become a policy. And so when we're talking about the politics of Mesopotamia, we're really talking about the policies. What were the public policies of this these river valley civilizations? And we're going to focus particularly into the kingdom of Babylon today. We haven't really talked about Babylon much. We've been talking about the Sumer, right, and the Sumerian culture. But, all kind of like same spot, same time period, sort of interchangeable as far as we're concerned. And we're going to focus in on the kingdom of Babylon, Babylon being another one of those kingdoms in Mesopotamia. And what was the idea? Was the idea that would eventually become powerful enough to become policy? The idea was that people were stealing my food. They're stealing it, right? I mean, like, come on. People were stealing food. And they were stealing land, right, in order to grow food, and they were stealing labor in order to produce more food, right? And there was just a lot of theft. There was a lot of stealing going on. Let's take a look. I'm going to switch over to the old PowerPoint here real quick. Let's see if I can do that efficiently. We shrink that up, and we come over to our PowerPoint presentation. And here is, right, the gist of what we're putting on the board here. There was too much theft. People were stealing food, and theft was a real problem. And so in the kingdom of Babylon, they created, and we'll put this on the board here in a minute, they created a codified set of written laws. So there's exactly what we're talking about with politics. These ideas would become a policy. It would become written law. And the written law was pretty straightforward. It was a basic legal code that discouraged bad behavior and getting revenge for other people's bad behavior. It discouraged people from stealing. And if you stole or anything of that nature, the basic idea of the Code of Hammurabi is that it was an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And I've got a little caveat down on the bottom, which when we look at the actual code here in a minute, we'll see it. The wealthy people really only paid fines if they hurt poor people and slaves, whereas if the poor people or slaves hurt wealthy people, they would literally have body parts removed. And we'll take a look at this code. I mean, it's kind of fascinating. We'll take a look at it in a moment. Here is the actual artifact, the Code of Hammurabi. We can see that it is scripted into this pillar. And they unearthed this thing somewhere around 1900. They kind of knew that it had existed. There was references to it, but they had never found it. And then they unearthed this sucker somewhere around 1901 as an archaeological artifact from this time period. So shifting back over to our camera so we can put some notes on the board. And we are going to focus in on the policy. All right, so we've got the idea, and the idea is going to become policy. And the policy is pretty straightforward. The king had this policy sculpted into that pillar, and they put the pillar up in the center of the city, in the center of the town. And so that way people would know the codified written laws, and they knew that if they did something, then there would be an immediate impact on them. Right, a legal impact on them. And so this is the Code of Hammurabi. I'm going to give this thing 3 stars because This is really the first example of a written codified law. And why is it important to write it down? If we were in class, I would ask that question, I would expect an answer. So think about that for a second. Why is it important to write laws down? Well, by writing them down, you're really discouraging people from committing crime. Right? The written piece discourages the bad action because you know what the punishment's going to be ahead of time. If the law's not written down, you might oh geez, I don't know, maybe I'll get in trouble, maybe I won't, roll the dice. Right? But if the law is written down, if the code is codified, like into law, sculpted, literally like sculpted into a pillar, you know what the punishment's going to be. And so part of this political idea is that you can actually discourage people from committing crimes in the first place by writing the laws down and letting them know what the punishment is going to be in advance. And so this Code of Hammurabi, we're going to summarize it. This is the eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Sort of just in summary, meaning if you did something to me, like if you poked my eye out, the punishment would be, we're going to poke your eye out. If you knock my tooth out, the punishment is, I'm going to knock your tooth out. Okay, and it's a pretty straightforward, very basic. I mean, just think of the time period here. We're still back like thousands of years before Common Era, before Christ. And so it's a very basic punishment system, but probably effective, right? If you do something bad to me, the law is going to make it. The king will decide to have something bad done to you. If you steal my food, you are going to be starved to death, or maybe even worse, we're going to chop your hand off, right? If you steal, we chop your hand off and then you cannot steal anymore. And so you've got real decisions to make before you go about stealing people's land or food, or if you're mean to their slaves or trying to like kidnap their slaves to free their slaves so that you have more workers, right? This is all bad stuff. Now, here's the caveat that we mentioned earlier. The Code of Hammurabi really only applied to, remember, let's see, from a few days ago, we talked about this little social pyramid here, right? These people at the bottom, they faced severe punishment through this Code of Hammurabi. They would be punished severely if they did something bad, if they broke one of the rules. But the code was written in a way, right? This policy was written in a way where if the king or some of the king's friends or noble people, if they did something bad, really not a whole lot would happen. They would maybe pay a fine. You know, they'd have to fork over some shekels or some silver minas, which was 60 shekels. And that was about it. So these people were fined very less severe punishments. And if you were poor or a lower social level, you would be severely punished through this Code of Hammurabi. As long as a noble didn't go ahead and, do something bad to another noble person, they just faced a little fine or so. All right, so it wasn't a very equal justice system, but it is really the first codified written justice system that we have as a reference point. Great. Let me take a look at the actual Code of Hammurabi here. We'll just focus in on just a few of the things that we might want to find interesting. If a son were to strike his father, you chop off his hand. And again, that would apply to lower. If we read this code closer, you'd see that these rules really only apply to the lower classes. If you break a man's bone, you have your bone broken. If you put out the eye of a commoner or break the bone of a commoner, then you only pay a little fine, right? And that's if a nobleman were to do that, right? Don't steal slaves. And we see that it really was all about food production and protecting people's land and food, right? They didn't want stuff stolen from them. I don't want stuff stolen from me either. So that all makes sense. Let's shift back over the camera. I'll say goodbye. Get those notes up for the last time for you. Okay. And that's it. That's the politics of Mesopotamia. Thanks a lot for joining. I think we switched to maybe the Indus and Tigris River valleys in India as our next case study. This was case study 1 on Mesopotamia. And our next video, we're going to shift over to case study 2. Great. See you then.